November 1941. The air is bitter cold, seeping through the cracks of a wooden freight car rattling on iron rails deep within the frozen wilderness of Siberia. Inside, 12-year-old Anya trembles, not only from the biting cold, but from the gnawing hunger and bone-deep fear. Around her, the muted sobs of other children dissolve into the haunting silence, punctuated by the distant wail of sirens and the cruel clatter of the train wheels. The smell of smoke and burning wood drifts faintly, mixing with the stench of sweat and desperation. This was no journey anyone chose. It was exile, a forced migration into the unknown with no food, no water, and no protection. Anya's eyes search the dim corners for hope, while their small hands clutch stolen scraps, sharing warmth with other ghostly orphans trapped in this moving prison. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Before the war swallowed her world, Anya was a simple girl from a quiet farming village near Lviv, then part of Poland's eastern borderlands. Her days had been painted with the soft hues of sunrise over wheat fields, the laughter of siblings playing in meadows, and the gentle hum of Sunday markets. She knew the steady rhythm of planting and harvest, the comforting smell of fresh bread, and the warm embrace of a mother's love. Her dreams were modest yet bright: education, friendship, dance, a future far from hardship. But war swept down like a savage storm, ripping apart the fabric of her peaceful life. Families vanished, homes were burned, and soldiers with stern faces replaced neighbors. One morning, the village awoke to the order of Soviet forces. Her family rounded up along with hundreds of others, packed into cattle cars for Siberia, their belongings left to the smoke and ash of a world destroyed. The freight train's journey was a procession of suffering. Overcrowded and unheated, the cars held dozens of orphans like Anya, children robbed of parents, security, and childhood. Food was non-existent, water a distant hope. The cold seeped into their bones as frost clung to cracked windows, and each breath was a visible reminder of life's fragility. Whispered stories of survival wove through the car's darkness, secret sharing of meager rations, traded pieces of cloth for warmth, silent songs to soothe fear. Despite their vulnerability, these children became unwilling witnesses and hidden heroes, shielding one another in impossible circumstances. Among them was the hope to save a tiny infant, found abandoned and whimpering near the train's end, a guardian act no one expected from those so powerless. Anya wrapped the child in scraps, risking discovery from the watchful eyes of soldiers. The war itself was the foe. Fear, hunger, relentless authority crushing human dignity. Yet in such cold and silence, courage bloomed quietly inside the hearts of the weak. This story unfolds against the brutal reality of Soviet mass deportations between 1940 and 1941, when an estimated 190,000 civilians, including many women, children, and the elderly, were forcibly uprooted from their homes in the western borderlands of the USSR. These individuals bore no weapons, held no rank, and carried no protection but their will to survive. The notorious train journeys to Siberia were marked by starvation, illness, and death. The transports were part of Stalin's harsh policy to depopulate and control regions deemed politically dangerous. The climax came one moonless night near a remote military checkpoint. Soldiers, cold and suspicious, boarded the carriages, patting backs and shining flashlights into every corner. Silence strangled the breath from every prisoner. Anya's heart pounded, the infant's fragile cries muffled against her chest. It was a moment suspended between life and death. Any sign of resistance or hidden life could unleash brutal reprisals. The fragile kindness of a soldier's gaze spared them that night, and the train lurched back into motion, delivering its cargo of despair further into emptiness. The consequences of their courage rippled beyond the journey's end. The rescued infant thrived. The group of orphans formed a fragile community, and their survival was a whispered testament to human compassion amid war's darkness. Yet such acts were lost to time, silenced by fear, destroyed documents, and fading memories. Decades later, a historian uncovered fragments from the Soviet archives, letters, and rare testimonies revealing these hidden stories. They remind us that courage lives not just in armies, but in the shattered, vulnerable souls who refuse to be erased. Anya's journey is a beacon, proof that even in the bleakest darkness, small acts of love and bravery can illuminate the path forward. This is the legacy of forgotten civilians whose stories shaped history, not with guns, but with humanity. November 1941. The cold Siberian air bites deeper with every mile the resettlement train presses into the vast, frozen wilderness. On board, Anya, barely 12, clings to the warmth of a cloth bundle, the only shelter for a starving infant found abandoned in the harsh darkness. The carriage is a packed coffin, bodies pressed close, breaths visible in the icy air, the distant clatter of iron wheels punctuated only by the whispered prayers of the forsaken. Before this nightmare, Anya's life was simple, helping her mother tend to the fields outside their small village near Lviv, dreams of school and friendship dancing in her childlike eyes. But the Soviet Red Army came sweeping through in 1940, dissolving the peaceful rhythm like a violent storm. Families were torn apart during the brutal mass deportations ordered by Stalin's regime, part of a broader political purge that would forcibly relocate millions deemed threats or undesirable. This was not a war fought on battlefields with weapons. It was war against innocence itself. The trains, known grimly as death transports, crammed civilians, especially orphans, women, and the elderly, into cramped, unheated freight cars with no food, no water, and no hope. Many perished on the journey as frost-bitten silence enveloped them. Anya's courage blossomed in this impossible crucible. She sheltered the infant with trembling hands, fought despair with whispered lullabies, and found strength where history expected none. The Soviet mass deportations from 1940 to 1941 uprooted over 1 million people from the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and other annexed lands. Entire families, communities, and ethnic groups were labeled enemies of the state, targeted for forced exile to Siberia and Central Asia. During the infamous June 1941 operation alone, approximately 34,000 Lithuanians, 15,000 Latvians, and 40,000 Estonians faced brutal transports where survival was a lottery no child or adult wanted to play. In one harrowing moment, near a frozen military checkpoint, Anya's small group faces discovery. Soldiers board the cars, their harsh voices and pointing guns slicing through the frightened silence. The infant's faint cries are muffled against Anya's chest. The moment stretches, breath held, heart pounding, until a lone soldier, perhaps recalling his own lost childhood, looks away, sparing them from immediate death. The aftermath was bittersweet. The saved life grew, small communities of orphans forged bonds of survival, and yet these acts of bravery dissolved into silence, buried in destroyed documents, shattered memories, and the shadow of fear. Decades later, archives uncovered fragments of these journeys, letters, testimonies, and records that piece together the stories of forgotten courage under unbearable hardship. They remind us that history is not just the story of armies and leaders, but of powerless children who chose hope amid darkness. Anya's story is a whisper echoing through time, a testament that even in the bleakest exiles, humanity endures. The Soviet mass deportations from 1940 to 1941 forcibly uprooted approximately 1.45 million people from annexed eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and other territories. Of these, around 63% were ethnic Poles, with significant numbers of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians also among those deported. The victims, civilians mostly with no weapons or protection, were packed into overcrowded freight trains and sent to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Far East, under brutal conditions marked by hunger, disease, frostbite, and death. For children like Anya, this war was not fought with guns, but with suffering endured in the darkest shadows of history. These resettlement trains were often called death transports because of the appalling conditions. No food or water was provided during many long freezing journeys. Many orphans were among them, separated from families or already alone, left to struggle with cold and fear. On the night near a military checkpoint, when soldiers boarded the train with guns ready to search for hidden prisoners or resistance, it was acts of compassion, like Anya's, to shield a small infant, that tipped the balance between life and death. The scale of deportations was part of Stalin's broader policy to suppress ethnic groups and political enemies, eliminate resistance, and reshape the demographic landscape of the USSR. Starting in June 1941, tens of thousands of families were targeted in the Baltic states alone, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, along with Poles and other minorities, leading to thousands of deaths in transit and exile camps. Despite this suffering, the story of resilience like Anya's has survived in whispered testimonies and rare archival documents discovered decades later. These stories reveal the unexpected courage of powerless civilians caught in the machinery of war. This devastating historical context sheds light on the immense human price behind the silent journeys of thousands of orphans on Soviet resettlement trains, lost to time yet remembered through the courage of those few who survived. Under the oppressive shadow of Soviet policy, the years 1940 and 1941 bore witness to vast, systematic deportations that reshaped entire populations and fates. The machinery of Stalin's regime orchestrated the forced removal of over 1.45 million people from border regions annexed into the Soviet Union, including Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Reports detail that tens of thousands of families, often labeled enemies of the state without cause, were seized from their homes in the dead of night. From June 1941 alone, upward of 70,000 individuals were deported from the Baltic countries, where entire segments of society, including the elite children and women, faced exile to the Soviet Far East, Siberia, and remote regions in Kazakhstan. The deportations were brutal and indiscriminate. Packed into overcrowded, unheated cattle cars, families, many with helpless children and orphans, were thrust into journeys measured in weeks or months. Food and water were scarce or non-existent, hygiene was impossible, and the winter's frozen grip meant death for thousands during transit. Conditions in Siberian exile zones were marked by forced labor, starvation, sickness, and isolation from any trace of home or hope. In this vast human tragedy, individual acts of courage emerged amid despair. The unnamed orphans, like Anya holding a fragile infant, became symbols of unnoticed heroism. Their survival was a defiant whisper against the roaring silence imposed by history. The Soviet deportation policies, part ethnic cleansing, part political repression, left indelible scars on entire communities and generations. It wasn't until decades later, through painstaking archival research and survivor testimonies, that the full scale and human cost of these brutal displacements began to emerge from the shadows. As this documentary unfolds, it is vital to center these forgotten civilians, unarmed, powerless, yet embodying extraordinary resilience. Their stories are as essential to the tapestry of World War II history as those of generals and battlefronts. They remind us that the true cost of war often lies buried in the silence of its forgotten children. In the spring of 1941, the silence of countless homes across the Baltic states shattered under the hammer of Soviet authority. From Lithuania to Latvia and Estonia, countries with centuries of proud history, a chilling decree promised exile to thousands. On the night of June 14th, at the hour when darkness seems most absolute, more than 70,000 people were forcibly removed from their beds and thrust into cattle cars bound for the frigid expanses of Siberia and Central Asia. Among the deportees were noble families, farmers, craftsmen, teachers, and children. 2,578 young lives ripped from tranquility to become ghosts on a ruthless train. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, managed the operation with merciless efficiency, mobilizing troops and local informants to ensure no one was left behind. For many, the journey became an endless nightmare. Unchecked cold seeped through the creaking wooden walls. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and disease spread silently in the cramped darkness. Walls that should have held warmth instead trapped breath and fear. The breadth of this forced migration was staggering. Approximately 1.45 million people were deported from annexed Polish territories alone between 1939 and 1941. About 63% were ethnic Poles, with Jewish minorities accounting for around 7%. These numbers only scratch the surface of the unimaginable personal losses hidden beneath statistics. Thousands of children, now orphans or separated from parents, were thrust into survival with no weapons, no ranks, no protection, only the fragile hope carried in their hearts. This vast web of sorrow was part of Stalin's broader strategy to consolidate power and suppress any potential dissent. Entire ethnic communities were labeled enemies, punished through exile and forced labor that claimed as many lives as the bullets of war. The famous death transports became the corridors of despair that swept civilians like Anya and her fellow orphans into a dark oblivion. Yet amid the frozen wasteland and barbed wires, whispers of hope persisted. Small acts of bravery, shielding a child from hungry eyes, sharing meager scraps, silent resistance in the face of brutal authority, shone like flickering candles in an endless night. Today, as historians sift through archival dust and survivors' fragile memories, these stories rise from the ashes, demanding remembrance. They remind us that the forgotten civilians, unarmed and vulnerable, were the hidden threads woven into the fabric of history, their courage forever etched in the snow-filled landscapes of the past. In late 1940, as winter's frost began to tighten its grip across the Soviet Union's vast expanses, ordinary lives stood on the cusp of irrevocable change. The Soviet regime, under Stalin's iron fist, executed sweeping policies targeting entire populations in newly annexed territories. Among those affected were humble peasants, workers, orphans, people like Anya, who bore witness not to grand battles, but to the quiet devastation of forced exile. Documented records reveal that from early 1940 until mid-1941, over 1.45 million people were deported from eastern Poland and the Baltic states. Poles constituted nearly two-thirds of this number, with Jews and other minorities also tragically caught in this purge. Prisoners of these death transports were crammed into unheated freight cars, deprived of food and water, exposed to brutal cold, and subjected to starvation and disease. In a chilling raid across the Baltics on June 14, 1941, the Soviet secret police arrested some 74,000 people within a single night. Families were torn apart, homes emptied, and thousands of children like Anya became the helpless orphans of wartime displacement. These deportations aimed not only to suppress political dissent, but to erase national identities by sending citizens to Siberia's frozen wastelands or into forced labor camps, the gulags, where survival was uncertain at best. For those on these freight trains, each day was a grim lottery against death. The rattling train cars moved relentlessly, yet the spirit of the deported was tested against unbearable hunger, fear, and despair. Anya's small act of protecting an abandoned infant was a silken thread of hope amid the iron machinery of repression. The Soviet deportations broadly aimed to Sovietize annexed borderlands and crush resistance by uprooting entire communities. Political purges, collectivization, and forced resettlement reshaped millions of lives, imprinting a legacy of sorrow and resilience. Though these mass deportations are well documented by historians, the personal stories of those like Anya have remained buried. Only in recent decades have archives and survivors' voices begun bringing to light the hidden human cost behind these brutal policies. This documentary honors those lost and forgotten, revealing through detailed cinematic narrative how powerless civilians endured extraordinary hardship and found courage in the darkest times.